All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Last Week in America. It's wonderful to see all of you once again. I hope that since we last spoke, all of you have had time to enjoy the holiday season with your loved ones, and perhaps some of you even made time to watch Home Alone or other Christmas movies. I remember last time a number of you were very excited to watch Home Alone. That seemed to be most of your all's favorite Christmas movie, which was interesting. And of course, you remember that I recommended you also consider watching A Christmas Story, Christmas Vacation, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and It's a Wonderful Life. So with that, the American Center is delighted to see you again. And I think that we have a good conversation planned for today. I think that you'll enjoy it quite a lot as we're wrapping up the holiday season. Now, as we discussed during our last conversation, we're sort of in the middle of the holiday season in the United States. And this is pretty exciting because we celebrate Christmas on December 25th. And for most Americans, that's the biggest holiday of the calendar year. And that's less than 2 weeks away. So great times in America right now, and everyone's gearing up for the holidays, getting very excited, making their travel plans, doing their last minute shopping, etc. So a great time to be here. Now, this discussion will be the final session of Last Week in America this year. So we'll start by covering the aspects of Christmas in America that we did not cover last week. That'll include Santa Claus, the shopping craze, etc. And then we'll have a brief sort of intermission for a couple of news items, which I think you'll find interesting. And then we'll finish by discussing American New Year's traditions, and maybe we could compare a bit with your own. So as always, throughout, please feel free to let me know if you have any questions in the chat. I like hearing from you all, as always, whether you're a regular viewer or it's your first time. So please don't be shy. Now, kicking things off with an interesting subject, Santa Claus. I remember that a lot of you expressed some interest in this during our last discussion, so I thought that we could cover it, more or less comprehensively. After all, Santa Claus is perhaps one of the most iconic figures in American Christmas. And the lore and person of Santa Claus in a lot of ways eclipses the explicitly religious trappings of the holiday for most Americans, which you might find interesting. And I presume that's become more popular over the decades, but Santa Claus looms so large over the holiday that many of you probably know quite a lot about him already. So today, hopefully we could add something new to your already broad knowledge base. Of course, Santa Claus is said to be, just in terms of appearance, a portly, jolly man, and he is said to live at the North Pole. There, Santa runs a workshop with his elves or his helpers, and they use this northern operation to make Christmas gifts for all the world's children. And on Christmas, Santa, he loads a reindeer-drawn sleigh full of gifts, and then he flies through the night, as you can see in this photo, and he visits each home throughout the world to deliver gifts to children who believe in him and who have been good. And we'll get back to those two qualifiers in a second. But anyway, once Santa's there, he lands his sleigh. If it's a home, he lands it on the roof and then jumps down the chimney and delivers the Christmas presents for the children, either under the Christmas tree, which is typically in the living room, or in the stockings, which in American tradition are hung above the fireplace. And he might just put the presents into the stocking. Anyway, to greet Santa, children who are by this point fast asleep on Christmas night. So when Santa arrives, the home is asleep, and especially the children are asleep. But I suppose you could say, preempting Santa's arrival, they leave cookies and milk by the fireplace. So Santa delivers the gifts, eats the cookies, and climbs up the chimney to rejoin his reindeer and his sleigh, which are on the roof. And then he sets off into the night for the next house. And you can see that I've listed ho 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 here because that's, of course, that's not just some, saying or some odd reference. It's apparently what Santa says. Of course, many of you hopefully have heard this on television or maybe seen a Santa Claus in person, but he's said to be so full of Christmas joy that he is belting out this laugh just because he's so happy for the holidays, and he's just such a jolly guy. But nonetheless, perhaps some of you have even seen Santa Claus in person. And as I said, you would know him by his appearance. In fact, Santa is a pretty heavy man. He's white bearded. He wears glasses and a red coat with a white fur collar and some other white fur accessories, like you can see in this photo here. And he is depicted wearing a matching hat. And you'll often see him carrying a big bag full of gifts for children, likely the same bag that you see loaded in his sleigh in this picture on the right. But the question is, how exactly did we learn about Santa Claus? How did this figure come to be? Was it always like this? Did it develop over time? In fact, it's somewhat interesting because the modern character of Santa Claus, as he's depicted in America, is in many ways an adaptation of, or a mixture of St. Nicholas and English Father Christmas, and also the Dutch Sinterklaas. So here we can see some photos of Santa Claus, and on the far right of St. Nicholas. But you might notice something special on the photo on the left. If you realize it, let me know. I don't know about your awareness of some of the details of the Santa Claus and related traditions in America. So let me know if this fact surprises you. But there is, of course, a reindeer. But what dignifies him is that he has this red glowing nose. And you might think, well, that's maybe like a Christmas ornament or some sort of strange seasonal affectation. But actually, that is a special reindeer who is named Rudolph. And it is said that Rudolph was born different than the other reindeer. And of course, more specifically, that he has a red, shiny nose. And the story goes that when Rudolph was young, because he was different, the other reindeer didn't want to play with him. They just thought he was strange and he was sort of outcast. But Santa Claus realized how special Rudolph was, and he recognized his nose and said, oh, that could be useful to me. Because after all, Santa is flying through the night, the dark night, on this sleigh. So he said that he wanted Rudolph to lead his sleigh because of the light emanating from his nose. So there's this idea of kind of the least of these becoming the leader of the pack, and he's being redeemed through Santa Claus, which is not it's not out of touch with the Christian trappings of the holiday in a certain way. Maybe that takes some mental acrobatics to get to that conclusion, but even still, it's there are plenty of movies in the American and I believe also the English tradition where Rudolph is depicted and they tell the story. But for whatever reason, we find it interesting and useful for dealing with the holidays, which I think is meaningful in some way. But also in the middle here, we can see a photo of what Santa's workshop might look like. That's where he and his elves would assemble the gifts for children around the world. and that is at the North Pole, as we said. So many of my favorite childhood memories are tied to Santa Claus. And this should be no surprise, I suppose. But every child gets excited as they anticipate Santa's arrival. In fact, leading up to Christmas, many American children try to meet Santa Claus and ask him for certain gifts that they'd like for Christmas. This begs mention of what I think will strike you as a pretty strange practice. In malls across America, Santa Claus will set up this grand display, sort of like a photography set. And he'll have this big chair, as you can see in the photo here, probably lots of gifts, a Christmas tree behind him. And Santa will sit in that chair as children wait to approach him. There's this big line leading up to the chair as everyone's excited to meet Santa Claus. And when it's his turn, the child will say hello to Santa. He'll sit on his lap, assuming it's a small child, like you can see in this photo. And then the child will politely ask Santa for a certain gift that he would like for Christmas. Maybe he wants a football or a board game or something like that, and he'll ask Santa for that item. And of course, rarely would Santa just give it to him then and there. It's something that, in terms of process, Santa would would sort of add to his to-do list and then deliver it on Christmas. As you can see, it feels sort of strange to articulate the reasons, the sort of logistics behind these processes that you just take for granted as a little kid. You don't think about these things. But nonetheless, all very interesting as to why certain practices are unique to America or perhaps relatively popular in America. I think it's worth considering. But anyway, while the child is in Santa's lap and asking for the gift, there's often a photographer, professional photographer, or the parents will take a photo, and this photograph will serve as a keepsake for the family through the years. In fact, I still remember doing this as a child. There are probably 3 or 4 distinct instances that I can remember meeting Santa Claus in this sort of setting. So I gather that it was, this is a bit of a digression, but I hope you'll permit me. This is a practice that was a bit more popular, say, 20 years ago when I was a young child. And that I think that's largely because this setup is really well, I suppose the arrangement conduces, or the indoor mall conduces to this sort of arrangement. And the indoor mall meaning, of course, just a vast collection of shops that are all in one, collected indoor building. After all, it's heated, it gathers people for a common purpose during the holidays. All of them are doing their Christmas shopping. There are restaurants nearby. So it's very convenient. It's a convenient location to do this activity. But in America, as you might find this interesting, indoor malls are kind of an endangered species. There are fewer and fewer of them. So when I was a child, it was quite popular, even just as a pastime for, say, teenagers to hang out at malls, or for adults to do their serious shopping at malls, or for children to look forward to going to the mall, because sometimes there were I guess you could call them playgrounds, or there were carousels or toy stores or other activities. Basically, there were activities that catered to each age group there. So there was a reason for all of us to go. But nowadays, for a number of reasons, malls are simply less popular in America, especially in the southern United States. That's largely because they've been replaced by another phenomenon, which is simply outdoor malls. and which is essentially the same concept without a roof over the head. So there is one such outdoor mall by my house, and they have the Santa Claus set up outside. And luckily in the South, it's warm enough to do that year round. It's about 60 degrees Fahrenheit right now, pretty warm here. So Santa has no problem going out there and doing it just as he would do in a normal mall. But even still, it rains quite a lot. And I think Christmas is in certain ways less popular or is taken less seriously today than it was when I was a child. I'm not totally confident in making that claim, but that's just my general read on it. And it's become at least marginally less important throughout my life. And I think that speaks to the fact that there are just fewer of these, Santa Claus encounters in contemporary America, but even still a very important part of one's childhood and extremely memorable. But moving on to finish our discussion on Santa Claus, it is worth noting a couple of things. The story goes that not all children receive Christmas gifts. In fact, there's this kind of moral reward structure involved. So only those who have been good will receive gifts. In fact, if a child behaves well during the year, then he'll find himself on what's called the nice list. And he can look forward to receiving gifts on Christmas. But if the child has behaved badly, perhaps by disobeying his parents, then he'll find himself on the naughty list. And you can intuit what that means. But instead of gifts, Santa will deliver a lump of coal in the child's stocking. Now, I grew up with plenty of people who were probably not on the nice list, so to speak. Even my brother, a few years. But I never heard of anyone actually getting coal. It seemed that everyone got gifts, maybe some years better than others, but it seemed like, delivering coal was a practice that was more popular, say, for my parents' generation, something that was prevalent 40, 50 years ago. But in today's day and age, it doesn't seem to happen all too often, but still very possible, I suppose. But another interesting fact is it's not simply enough to be good to receive gifts. That perhaps is more prevalent in American Christmas, and I suppose maybe German Christmas, and also other Northern European versions of Christmas, basically Protestant countries. That there's this aspect of belief, which I think is actually very interesting. And there have probably been academic articles written on the subject. But here's why it's interesting. It's said that one must, especially in these countries, and including America, it's said that one must believe in Santa Claus to receive gifts. And this is sort of in line with, what is known as the magic of Christmas. And it's worth noting that this is an allusion to the holiday's Christian foundation because there are emphases on both faith or belief and works. That is, whether a child earns his way onto the nice list or the naughty list. And the lore and mysteries surrounding Santa Claus are, by no stretch of the imagination, unlike the holy mysteries of the church. That is, the things that can't be understood by reason alone. So they require some faith, some belief. And for these reasons, some sociologists argue that the presence of Santa in American pop culture, as well as the other Protestant, other countries where there's a predominance of Protestantism, that Santa and the surrounding lore in Christmas is partly a mechanism for socializing children into the Christian faith. And I find that quite interesting because, like I said, there are these parallels dealing with belief or faith, and earning rewards through works. So it's worth considering. But I'm not sure how many of you are with us today, but please feel free to write in the chat any questions you have throughout. Especially, I'd like you to comment on these two if you could. I'm curious, did you learn anything new about Santa Claus today? And also, how does Santa compare to Father Frost? This came up in our previous discussion, and I think it made for a pretty lively dialogue, because I think that our traditions and our customs are similar, but they're far from identical. And I think pointing out those similarities and differences makes for an interesting comparison. So please, in the chat, write to me and let me know whether you learned something new about Santa and perhaps how Santa compares with Father Frost. And while I'm waiting on those, I'll go ahead and start our next topic, which is, of course, holiday shopping. And a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this, but I think that the holiday shopping craze, while it shouldn't be unfamiliar to any European viewers, and especially Western viewers, is that I think it takes on a distinct manifestation in America. Maybe just because everything is so exaggerated. It's done on such a large scale that I think you know it when you see it, sort of thing. You know that it's an American phenomenon. At least the scale of it is something that you wouldn't likely see in another country, except maybe in isolated events. So the discussion of American Christmas would effectively be incomplete without some discussion of shopping, at least brief mention, because of course Santa Claus is not the only one who's giving gifts on Christmas. And this has come up throughout our discussions. So hopefully this discussion will tie together some of what we've discussed before. But because Christmas shopping is so important to retailers, Christmas has expanded into a, quote, season. And I put that into air quotes because Christmas is, of course, celebrated on December 25th. There is also Christmas Eve, which is celebrated just as seriously, which is December 24th. But nowadays, it seems that Christmas lasts the whole month of December. And more than that, it seems like people deliberately anticipate Christmas, that it's on the mind, starting in the early or mid-fall. And we'll get to why that is, because there's a reason for it. That main reason is retail. And that's, it explains this sort of holiday sprawl that we've been discussing. And the bottom line is that the holiday season is no longer today what it was years ago, because it's profitable for businesses to market a longer holiday season for the sake of their profits. For example, you've probably heard that Christmas decorations go for sale in October, over 2 full months before Christmas. So indeed, the shopping craze begins early. And it's not as if Americans are immune to it. We say, oh, there are sales going on, there are decorations in the stores, we're just going to abstain from it. No, we can't escape it, because the marketing begins early. So you'll probably know of Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. I believe effectively that's the 4th Friday in November every year. And we call it Black Friday because it's a day when shops and businesses not only offer tremendous discounts, but because it pushes businesses into profitability. And the slang for that is in the black. So in the black means being profitable. And I think this can account for a substantial portion of their annual profit. So it's a huge deal that these businesses capitalize on the window of opportunity presented by Black Friday and the subsequent holiday shopping season. But thus begins the shopping season, and Americans buy several gifts for loved ones, mostly for family and close friends. But I'm limited to autobiography. I can only speak for the area that I grew up in, the class that I grew up in. But oftentimes people will get single gifts for people that they know reasonably well. Perhaps they'll get something nice for a neighbor, or perhaps they'll give a gift to their best friend or to their girlfriend or boyfriend. But typically in families, the gift giving is far more prolific. And it's often that the parents are giving naturally more gifts to the children. And sometimes there's no expectation that children would give gifts unless it's under a certain circumstance. But within the family, it's almost always older people giving gifts to younger people. So, and of course, that's not a hard and fast rule. But to illustrate, when I was younger, my parents would give my brother and me Christmas gifts. And meanwhile, my grandparents would give my parents Christmas gifts, but my parents would also give my grandparents Christmas gifts. So, the bottom end of the hierarchy is pretty much top down. Parents give gifts to kids. But on the upper end, it seems like adults more freely exchange gifts between themselves. And as a child gets older, of course, there's more of an expectation for him to get gifts for his parents, for his, less often his grandparents, but you see how the logic works. Now, the biggest demographic at play in holiday shopping is, you could probably guess it, it's parents. And they're mostly buying Christmas gifts for their children. And a number of these shoppers put off shopping until late, only a few days before Christmas, maybe today, for example. So it's cliche in American culture for someone to be stressed only days before Christmas because they have yet to do holiday shopping. And it's a trope in American films and TV shows that Christmas is just around the bend. There are these lights, there's this joy, and it's really an aesthetically beautiful time of year. But then you have some like haggard, stressed adult roaming through a mall somewhere because they're like trying to check items off the list. And at that point, sometimes an item will be out of stock, so then they have to adapt. Anyway, it's a common plot because it's relatable. A lot of people do it. They put off their shopping until late. But it's easy to be critical of this extended holiday season. You could say, oh, this is consumerism run amok. And I think partly you'd be right, but it's not all bad. After all, it's extremely good for the economy. And I think in moderation, that it's good for Americans because it is a period of general goodwill. And it's an occasion also, not just for buying gifts, but giving more generally, giving your time to spend with friends and family, finding occasion to be charitable, philanthropic, to do volunteer work. So the bottom line is that for many Americans, the ideal is to give more than you get. But the extended Christmas season, as we're calling it, is about far more than shopping. And I think really it is about giving rather than just buying things. It's at some point there is a level of obligation to give gifts, especially to children. And sometimes that's not always financially an easy thing to do for some families. But nonetheless, people regularly do it. Even if they can't, get exactly, the perfect gift, they'll often get something, even if it's small. And I think that level of sacrifice is really admirable especially when it's done out of love. So now we'll move on to the news. But if you have any questions on the Christmas season, please feel free to write them in the chat. I'd be interested to hear your perspective and to dialogue a little bit on that. So let's see. A few of you have already sent in comments, I believe, from earlier. One is from Valeri. Christmas fir tree is also important for sure. I know there's even one, in my living room right now. So very, very important. Arena says Father Frost seems kinder to me. I don't know. I feel like that. That's very funny. Arena, I don't know if you were with us a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, we were briefly discussing the differences between Father Frost and Santa Claus, because I myself I was at a Russian museum in Washington, D.C., and it was about this time of the year, but a couple of years ago. And they had this old man in this white beard, and he had this big blue cape and was walking around. And I had never seen Father Frost. So I was caught almost totally off guard. And having never seen this man, he looked similar to Santa Claus, but it was something foreign and unfamiliar to me. So I thought him to be less kind than Santa Claus, because I'm so familiar, with the Santa that I'd grown up with. But I can see that how, to someone who hasn't, maybe where Santa Claus is not the main point of reference, that he could seem less kind. But at least in, among American children, and perhaps also wherever you are in the world, that children see Santa Claus as, kind of an object of affection. It's someone that if they saw him, they'd get really excited. They might feel predisposed to hug him or thank him. There's a sort of tender place in people's hearts for Santa Claus. And I think that in America, young children aren't familiar with him. They might be afraid because they hear this, they see this big man with this deep voice. But I think as children grow older, they become more comfortable with this stranger, and eventually come to love him, which I think is quite interesting. And then now Sophia is commenting, I should say that in Russia, there is a stronger association between Father Frost, gifts, lights, and parties, and New Year rather than Christmas. Yes, that's another interesting dimension of this. It seems that in Russian culture, and perhaps in Slavic cultures generally, New Year's is of greater emphasis, and also Easter is of greater emphasis. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But it seems that in American culture, and I think I could presume the West generally, that writ large for a society, Christmas seems to be the more broadly practiced and more intensely practiced holiday. And again, maybe that has something to do with Protestantism rather than, I'm really not sure what could explain it. There are certainly a number of potential explanations. Now, Valeri is commenting, in Russia, we have a girl, Snegorochka. I'm not familiar with this concept, so please feel free to write in. I'm assuming this is a personage relating to the Christmas season, but feel free to clarify for me. Oh, let's see. A few more questions. Bear with me. Sophia is commenting again. How many days off work do you usually have for Christmas? Quite a few. So it varies, but school children get a few weeks off of school. For example, my brother is home from college right now. And in total, he has approximately 3.5 weeks to 4 weeks off of school. So you could say a month off. That's pretty big. As for adults, they typically will have anywhere from 3 days to 7 days, 3 days to a week. And they'll almost always have Christmas Eve, the 24th, off. They'll have Christmas off, of course, and often they'll have the day after Christmas off. Typically, the day after Christmas is, it's probably not a strange concept at all. You just like to take it easy, spend time with your families, and that sort of thing. But of course, as we'll discuss, New Year's is a big holiday too. Not nearly as big as Christmas. The parties are bigger. But you can understand, of course, that Christmas is on the 25th and New Year's is on the 31st, New Year's Eve. And if you take that to Christmas Eve on the 24th, you have this, period of holidays going from December 24th to December 1st, which is New Year's Day. We'll clarify this in a second. But you have roughly a week of holidays. And it's not like each of those days is a celebration, but you can say, well, we have these two bookends. We might as well give our employees the whole week off. So you can leave work on December 23rd and we'll see you in the new year. And I think that's standard practice. It seems that a lot of people in corporate America get roughly a week off, which I think is pretty generous. And I think that allows for travel throughout the United States, because again, it's pretty common in the USA for people to live in different parts of the country, at least different parts of a region. So my family is spread throughout the Southeast, but others will have relatives in California, New York, and maybe even in Canada, or Mexico. So time to travel is important as well, because it just takes a long time to cover ground. And of course, as we discussed, we celebrate Christmas on the 25th, technically. But as we alluded to, it's not that cut and dried, because we celebrate it also on the 24th, Christmas Eve. And for several days leading up to Christmas. So it's spread out, but the big day is Christmas Day, December 25th. Grapefruit Orange, good to see you again. Commenting, hi all, I have a question. Why is Santa sometimes called Kringle? It's an interesting question, and I don't have the exact answer, but he's sometimes called Kris Kringle or Christopher Kringle. I would imagine that Kris Kringle is one of many people that we've mentioned, many historic people, off of which Santa Claus is based, or of which Santa Claus is a kind of combination, or by which he was inspired. Kris Kringle, as I understand it, was, maybe someone from Northern Europe who was a charitable member of his community, especially around Christmas, and especially giving gifts to poor children. But my historical knowledge is based on a cartoon film that I saw when I was younger. I actually don't know much about Kris Kringle or whether he's a truly historical person, but that's the reason for Kringle, is because there is apparently another figure called Kris Kringle that is related to Santa Claus. That is, in some stories, they could be the same person. In other stories, Kris Kringle could be like the historical figure on which Santa Claus is based, etc. Now, Victor says, regardless of age, everyone loves to receive gifts. Agree with you there, Victor. Now, Valeri, I see the clarification. The girl, Snegorochka, is always with Father Frost. Like Rudolph, she is a helper. Yes. So in the anecdote that I was relaying earlier about the Russian museum that had this, scary Father Frost, also had, could you call her Sister Frost, Sister Winter, Mother Winter, something like that? But they had a Snegorochka, and she was, standing there very quietly while Father Frost was kind of dominating the scene. And you might be interested to know that in this is not unique to America, but in the the Christmas tradition with which I'm familiar, we have Santa Claus, of course, but we also have Mrs. Claus. This is Santa Claus' wife. She is, to an extent, she's his helper. But she's depicted in a similar way to Santa Claus. She's, a sturdy woman. She's, very jolly like Santa Claus. She's joyous, and she's depicted as an old woman, like could be anyone's grandmother. And again, people love to see her. She's admired. She's not viewed with any kind of suspicion. She's a celebrated figure, but not nearly as important as Santa Claus. She probably constitutes maybe 5% of, what would you say, the presence of Santa Claus. It's almost all about Santa. Okay, so Sophia is clarifying that Snegorochka is the granddaughter of Father Frost. Good to know. Let's see. So please feel free to continue commenting. We'll get to the news very quickly, and then we'll discuss New Year's. So you may have heard that on the evening of December 10th, that a pretty substantial storm or system of storms swept through the central USA. And this resulted in widespread severe weather across the region. And this included a long track tornado, or twister, as they're sometimes called. And early surveys suggested that the tornado began in Arkansas, sort of in the southeast, edging on the Midwest, and moved through Missouri, then Tennessee, then Kentucky, then Illinois. And the tornado caused significant destruction to portions of the region. And American news networks, maybe some of you have seen this, have been covering the news story almost nonstop, and for good reason. The combined fatalities from the tornado outbreak totaled at least 14, according to the Associated Press, making the death toll from the tornado outbreak approximately 88 people across those 5 states. And this is being updated by the days because you can't get an accurate count right away due to phenomena like missing persons and the like. But this is quite the pivot from Santa Claus, but it's currently very big news in America, and people are fixated on this story, and for good reason. There were a total of 34 confirmed tornadoes across 8 states during the weekend of the outbreak. I mean, can you believe that? 34 tornadoes, 7 of which were rated at what the National Weather Service would basically call a high strength. There's a more technical term, but they were high strength tornadoes, so extremely fast winds, etc. And one of the 34 tornadoes that occurred on Friday night when it was totally dark had an approximate wind path of 227 miles. And I'm assuming that means like the tornado has touched down on the ground, or is at least in significant proximity to the ground, and it more or less maintained that distance for 227 miles, making it particularly destructive for that distance. And of course, that's spanning, in effect, about 4 states, which is just incredible, with 200 miles in the state of Kentucky alone. Kentucky seems to be the worst affected state, with homes and towns being completely destroyed. However, there's, you call it a silver lining in a way, or at least an upswing to this, if you could even call it that, to this tragedy, because for all the carnage, Americans are helping those who lost everything. Of course, state services are managing the natural disasters fallout, But what's even more amazing is that everyday Americans, people not too different from you or from me, from all over the USA, are traveling to some of the worst affected areas, like the one you see photographed here. And these people just volunteered. They just took it on themselves to go to these areas to render first aid, to carry out search parties for missing persons, and to rebuild communities. These volunteers have jobs and responsibilities, and they have mortgages, they have bills to pay, but they saw people in need. They saw their countrymen in need, and they volunteered to go help them, to put their lives on hold so that they could go help their neighbors. I think that is an incredible story, and I think it speaks to the best in American culture. Anyway, we'll move on to another story that might interest you. And I think this one could be relatable, but I think there's a particularly American twist to this. So like the rest of the world, the USA is doing its best to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. I think in a lot of ways we're all anyway, kind of over the news of the pandemic because there's just fatigue of the news of it. So we won't address the pandemic this week, but we'll address something that is related because part of the effort of combating the pandemic has involved new work patterns. Some of you are probably doing this. I've been doing this. Some of us at the American Center have been doing this. But many Americans are working from home, often via computer. And now, even in corporate America with big companies, it's rare to visit the office. On the one hand, it's unadvisable from a health perspective, of course, that's a given. But the other aspect of this is that because it has been unadvisable for public health reasons, people have had to adjust, they've had to work from home, and now they see it as, I don't know if you could say, less necessary to go in the office. You realize after having spent so long away, maybe you don't need to go into the office for so much. Maybe you could get away with doing most of your work from home, and hey, maybe companies can even save some business. Some of they could increase their profits because they have less overhead costs. They don't have to rent office space at all, or at least they don't have to rent as much office space because fewer of their employees are coming into the office for work. So not all bad. And after all, we've been doing this for nearly 2 years now. Hard to believe. But most people understand that the new work patterns could be what we would call the new normal. That's something that comes along, which has so significantly disrupted whatever came before it, whatever the common practice was before, that it's now the new normal, so to speak. And it's not all bad. Like I said, after all, if you rarely visit the office, then you no longer need to live near the office, which is often located in a big, expensive city. You could move outside the city, live in a bigger house, and pay less money, enjoying a lower cost of living. And many Americans realize this and are moving out of big cities and traditionally populous regions. In fact, many Americans are moving to the southern USA, where I live, and to the countryside. So in the graphic provided by the Brookings Institution, I believe, and then promulgated by The Economist, we can see that the USA's share of population by region is growing in the South and in the West, traditionally less populous regions, and it's decreasing in the Northeast, which is typically is generally where our major financial center is. It's where a number of our large corporations are headquartered. It's where a lot of people live, just practically speaking. The East Coast, particularly the Northeast, think New York, Connecticut, etc., it's where a lot of our major cities are in very close proximity to one another. And people are leaving because it's extremely expensive to live there. And if these people don't need to be near the office, can they justify the cost of living there? Sure, maybe they have family, but then again, maybe it's worth moving to, instead of living in Philadelphia, maybe you could live in the rural part of your state, in rural Pennsylvania, or in line with these data, perhaps you could move to my state, Georgia. But The Economist summarizes these trends pretty well. It says, quote, migration is following two trends, both of which existed before the pandemic. First, people have been leaving large, dense, expensive urban cores for smaller, less dense cities and suburbs. And second, people and companies have been moving to warm, low tax states in the South and the Southwest. And amidst the pandemic, Americans do seem to be moving south and some to the West, to areas that are relatively affordable. It's less expensive to live here than it is in New York. Largely rural. There's a lot of undeveloped land around here. In states like this, there's typically one big urban center, a series of smaller cities, and then and then grass and trees. The countryside is not very developed, so land is cheap. There's a lot of space for housing developments, and some of these states have no income tax. And they also have strong senses of community. You know, Southerners and to an extent Westerners are known for being hospitable, welcoming, traditionally valued. So they're very much about like what's in their locale. Oftentimes there's less focus on global affairs and more focus on your community, your neighborhood, your city. And anecdotally, I can speak to this because, as you know, I live in Atlanta, which is a major city, but many of my friends and relatives, four that I can think of off the top of my head, have moved to more rural locations amidst the pandemic. And in my case, they've all gone to Tennessee and to Texas, both of which are, again, southern, largely rural, and in these cases, have no state income tax. Even my parents are considering moving to Tennessee. So please tell me whether you see similar patterns in Russia. Either way, it'll be interesting to see how these trends develop in the coming years. So our next slide will be our last slide, and we'll discuss briefly New Year's traditions. But first, let me know in the chat, how do you think America's New Year celebrations compare to Russia's? And then, what is your favorite New Year tradition? Please let me know in the chat before we get to our last slide of the day. Let's see. Some people are commenting. We go through here very quickly. Grapefruit Orange says, I wonder, do you guys think it's a good idea to teach kids about Santa? I read that for a lot of people. Let's see. Let's see. Interesting comments here. Grapefruit Orange says, the news about the tornado is so heartbreaking. It is so wonderful that people are helping those affected. Can meteorologists predict when tornadoes will happen? Yes, indeed. Of course, I don't know the specifics, but I think that the notice time is short compared to other significant weather events like hurricanes. It's more difficult to see them coming. I think it's because they're caused by, I think, like undulations in temperature, maybe warm fronts, which I think in this case, explain the severe winds, and that makes it less difficult to predict, or less difficult to predict on a short timeline. But yeah, I agree. It's inspiring, frankly, that everyday people are going out to help those in need. If the internet collapses, what will all these home workers do? Probably become farmers or something. I don't know. Like, what do you do in a service economy, amidst post-materialism, we're exceedingly dependent on the internet. So you raise a good point, that we could do a lecture or a lecture series on that question alone. But I agree, Valeri, that it's an important one to ask for sure. So in the interest of time, please continue to comment as you wish. And I'll go through our last slide here. Marina says, America's New Year celebration is not a big deal, it seems. It's a party time for youngsters mostly. That's pretty accurate. Just after Christmas comes, it's the New Year celebration. But we celebrate New Year's Eve, naturally, on December 31st, which is the last night on the calendar. And for Americans, New Year's Eve is a time to take stock of the past year and to consider the good and the bad and to be grateful that a new year awaits. But most of all, it's a time to party like mad. And perhaps part of the psychology is that, whatever debauchery or bad decisions or excess might take place on New Year's Eve, that it's left in the past year. That is, it only applies to your past self because it can't follow you into the new year. Convoluted rationale, but even still. New Year's Eve is probably the wildest party day of the year. Of course, we have 4th of July, which can get pretty raucous. Then there's also Halloween, which is huge. But New Year's Eve, I think, is the biggest of them all. And many families will host private parties and many venues will host special parties of their own. But regardless of whether you're at a party or just watching, just kicking back at your house, Americans typically stay up until midnight to greet the new year. It's like this act of national solidarity. We're all doing this together. And in fact, many watch a live recording of Times Square, different time zones, of course. But you've probably seen this footage of Times Square in New York City. There's a big ball that drops. I encourage you to look up videos of this. A big ball that drops on this sort of tower-like structure on pace with the New Year countdown. And wherever you are at this time, when the clock strikes 12 and we've entered the new year, it's customary to kiss someone and to usher in the new year. Now, the next day, January 1st, is New Year's Day, and it's a more relaxed occasion. On this day, people have hope that they can improve themselves. New year, new me, as they say. And many Americans will implement New Year's resolutions and how they'd like to change themselves in the new year. And for many of them, this means exercising and eating healthfully. Those are probably the most popular. Gym memberships skyrocket at this time of year, and you'll see a lot of commercials for them, etc. Another interesting tradition is that many Americans will eat black-eyed peas and collard greens on New Year's Day. You think, that's strange. Well, these two vegetables, the former, black-eyed peas, symbolize prosperity, and the latter, collard greens, symbolize wealth. And you eat these sort of ritualistically on New Year's Day because they symbolize like you're focusing or you're welcoming prosperity and wealth in the new year. So one last comment from Valeri says the favorite Russian New Year tradition is to decorate the fir tree. That's quite interesting because in America, it's common to leave up the Christmas tree, as we'd call it. It's here, it's not a fir tree. It has, for us, little to do with New Year. It's all about Christmas. But you'll see Christmas trees left up in America sometimes through January. Some of them might be up until mid-January, even until February if you're really bad. But that's not because we place significance on it for the new year, though that could develop over time. I think mostly it's because in America, people are they just don't want to take down their tree. They like the way it looks, or maybe they're lazy or procrastinating in some way. They just don't take it down. But it's not because for us, it bears meaningful significance for the New Year celebration. But it's interesting that we diverge in that respect. Let's see. Sophia comments, I like that we have a lot of food, sitting together, listening to the president's wishes and grateful words from TV. And after midnight, fireworks, laughing, singing, and dancing start. That's a beautiful thing. And it's nice to be together as a country as well, sharing in this experience. There's a real sense of like solidarity on a mass scale on New Year. And of course, it's big on American media to see streams of New Year celebrations all around the world happening in different time zones. So you'll see the clock strike 12 in Tokyo, Moscow, Berlin, I mean, all over the world. So there's the sense that, it's not only big for you and for the people at your party, and not even just for the people in your country, but all around the world. And I think it's a great thing that we can all put our intentions in the right place and see how we could make life better for all of us in the new year. And one last comment from Marina. I feel like more and more people go straight to bed before midnight on December 31st. Well, maybe so. Hopefully maybe the pandemic's encouraging that. Who knows? Who knows? But I, for one, love to go out and party on New Year's Eve. It's just a great night that has that sense of possibility, a lot like Halloween does, where, of course, everyone's hopefully obeying the law, but there's the sense of possibility in the air. Not that there are no rules, but there's like a suspension of the normal social norms. So people dress in a particularly extravagant way. For example, fireworks are going off in Times Square. It's as you can see in the photo. There are concerts, massive crowds. It's just an incredible time and a lot of fun. So if you're in the USA on New Year's Eve, I highly encourage you to experience it in the American way and to compare it to your own traditions. Or this year, perhaps you could watch the live streams of the clock striking 12 and us all celebrating in Times Square in Manhattan. So that's all for today. The communications team will be in touch with you about when our next session will be. But until then, I'll be wishing each of you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Bye, everyone.